What if I told you the funniest man in the kingdom lived one joke away from a public whipping? What if the guy making the king snort wine through his nose could be jailed for a bad pun? Welcome to the twisted world of court comedy where the punchline could punch back. If you're new here, don't forget to follow or subscribe to the channel. And hey, drop a comment below telling us your city and what time it is. It's always wild to see where everyone's watching from. Alright, lights down, volume up, maybe toss a blanket over your feet. Tonight, we slip into the chaotic, humiliating, and sometimes horrifying life of Rowan Titch, professional mood booster to the most dangerous people in medieval society, the court fool. The floppy hat, the ridiculous bells, the wobbly grin, it all seems adorable, until you realize this gig had a zero-fail policy. Now, let's be clear, nobody chooses to become a jester. You don't study at clown college and walk out with a scroll and a horn. It just happens to you like a plague, or an unpaid debt. You're picked not for skill, but because you're entertaining, which usually meant you looked or sounded odd. A limp, a screechy voice, maybe a brain wired a little sideways. And just like that, some duke snaps his fingers and says, "That one's weird. I like it. Keep him." And boom, your weirdness is now your job description. Sometimes, your entire career began because you made a lord chuckle during supper. Maybe you tripped in pig slop or insulted Baron Lumpy just loud enough to draw snorts. Next morning, you're no longer in your mud-stained peasant hut. You're being handed a hat with horns and bells, told to make mirth, and your life becomes one long, terrifying audition. Other times, Rowan wasn't even hired, he was bought, like a jug or a monkey. Nobles collected jesters the way rich people today collect NFTs. Confusing, expensive, and mostly for show. If you were especially witty or just had a face like a startled goose, you might be passed around like a gag gift. Here's something ridiculous from Count Dremel's court. You'll love him. Application not required. Consent not considered. From the moment you got picked, you became the breathing laugh track of the palace. You weren't just cracking jokes at banquets. You were being yanked into tense political councils, dragged out to distract from royal tantrums, and forced to giggle through dinner while half the table glared. Refusing was not an option. Walking away meant becoming just another landless man loitering near the market, and, in medieval law, that made you suspicious enough to get shackled, just for existing. So yes, officially, you were a performer. In reality, a stress reliever in tights. Now let's talk living conditions. You're not snoozing in silk sheets with the other nobles. Rowan's bedroom was a glorified pantry wedged between the cook's herb rack and a stack of pickled eels. His bed? A flour sack. His meals? Mostly scraps. His outfits? Cast off, sewn together by someone who definitely had a grudge against color theory. And anytime something went sideways, a hunting trip flopped, the queen's wig caught fire, the royal pigeon burped, guess who got a knock at midnight? Do something funny, they'd whisper like a threat. But here's the mind twist. Over time, you stop pretending. You become the jester. The bells, the buffoonery, the fake cheer, it fuses to your bones. You forget what your laugh really sounds like. Your real self, buried under layers of forced grins and fart jokes. The role consumes the person. Because being a jester isn't a shift you clock into. It's a permanent performance, with no intermission. Even when not on duty, Rowan was being observed. Walking past the Duchess? Better throw in a spin. Sitting too quietly at dinner? Someone asks, why isn't the clown doing anything? And God forbid you look tired or worse, sad. That wasn't entertaining. That was suspicious. Emotions? Dangerous territory. Sadness made people uncomfortable. Anger made them anxious. Silence? Unforgivable. The moment you weren't giddy, people assumed you were plotting something. The king doesn't like it when the comedy stops. That's how heads roll. And let's not pretend palace life was glamorous. You were near the party but never in it. You heard the laughter, but it wasn't for you. You ate the leftovers. You wore the hand-me-downs. You weren't treated like a guest or even a servant. You were furniture that giggled. Had a rough morning? Maybe the royal goose bit you? Doesn't matter. You're still expected to trip, rhyme, and juggle fire if someone so much as yawns. Let's not forget the pressure to be original. Recycle a punchline? Unacceptable. These were noblest, spoiled, bored, and impossible to impress. Your 10-line satire about the bishop's hairline? Great, now make 12 more before tea. And impersonate Lord Prigsworth while hopping on one leg. Flop once? You don't get a bad review. You get tomatoes, or boots, or fired. And fired didn't mean a polite exit package. It meant chamber pot duty, or disappearing into the moat. And everyone else at court, allowed to weep, rage, pray, or spiral, you danced through it, because that's what jesters did. You became a moving target of ridicule, irony, and emotional suppression with a hat that jingled. Your mental state? Irrelevant. Your job? Keep powerful psychos laughing, even when your own heart's falling apart. And then there's the real danger, crossing the line. The royal line was invisible, movable, and deadly. A joke about the Duke's balding head? Hilarious on Monday. Treason on Tuesday. Laughed at on Wednesday. Death sentence by Thursday. Every court had its mood swings. One day the Queen's in stitches about her cousin's gambling. Next day he walks in, and now you're sowing dissent. And forget metaphors, they better be wrapped in 3 layers of animal sounds and mime acts. The rooster with no eggs better not really mean the bishop. And if someone takes offense, no one defends the jester. You're not clergy, not noble. You're expendable, an amusing accessory with a short shelf life. When your license to mock expired, so did you. Some got whipped, some vanished. Some were just retired medieval for buried in secret. So yes, comedy was your sword, but it was also your collar. And all this, mind you, before you even open your mouth. Because your outfit, Rowan's glorious humiliation suit, spoke volumes. A clown's coat stitched in chaotic colors, bells sewn to everything, shoes curled up like cinnamon rolls. His entire look screamed, I am here for your amusement, and I have no say in the matter. You ever wear something so embarrassing, people laugh before you speak? That was the entire point of Bramley Knott's wardrobe. His job wasn't just to crack jokes, it was to look like a living parody of fashion itself. His hat flopped like dying fish. His tunic looked like a cart accident at a paint shop. And even his belt was knotted in ways that made it useless for holding anything. Knives? A pouch? Please. Bramley wasn't there to carry things, she was there to stumble, jingle, and perform pratfalls on command, wrapped in a mascot outfit designed by someone with a grudge against dignity. While Duke's shimmered in velvet, silk, and fur-trimmed gold thread, Bramley's clothing was stitched together from discarded rags that felt like sandpaper soaked in regret. If it was itchy, too hot, or visibly stained, that meant it was perfect. The costume wasn't just theatricality, it was psychological warfare. It screamed to the entire court, this man is beneath you. Laugh accordingly. And there was no escape. Weddings, feasts, midnight negotiations about war taxes, she wore the same ridiculous outfit to all of them. There was no formal jester wear or casual Fridays. His look remained permanently ridiculous. Even when he was furious or heartbroken, Bramley still resembled a human coloring book, exploded and reassembled by a drunk tailor. Compliments, please. Instead of nice hat, it was try not to jingle yourself off a cliff, fool. Or worse, people yanked his sleeve just to hear the bells, like a tragic wind chime with abandonment issues. Iconic? Maybe. But those clothes were also shackles. A flashy reminder that no matter how sharp Bramley's wit was, his appearance kept him boxed in as safe, soft, and silly. His words might pierce, but his outfit reassured the powerful that he was never truly dangerous, just a jester, a chuckle in cloth. And sure, he lived inside the castle, but don't get it twisted. Bramley wasn't part of the royal circle. He was the decorative noise in the background, a tapestry with a pulse. If he had a room at all, it was probably a pantry-turned-storage space near the scullery, close enough to smell the feasts, far enough to be ignored. Yet always close enough to be pulled out for a midnight joke when the Baron got indigestion or someone needed a wedding toast rewritten at 2 a.m. Meals were the worst. Bramley didn't dine with nobles. He hovered, stood awkwardly close, got crumbs thrown at him, maybe even caught a chicken wing to the face if he lingered too long. Yes, he technically ate from the same platters, but Only after the barons, the priests, the dogs, and once, memorably, the stable hand with pink eye. Still, he heard everything. Affairs whispered between mouthfuls. Secret deals disguised as gossip. Who hated whom? Who envied whom? What treaties were crumbling beneath smiling toasts? Bramley, the royal fool, was the one soul in the room no one bothered to hide things from. Not because they trusted him, because they dismissed him. To them, he was harmless, background noise, a walking bell rack. But information has weight, and sometimes it's the only shield you've got. The tragedy was this. Bramley knew more than most. He lived under the same roof as lords and generals, but he was caught in social no man's land. Nobles saw him as too low to matter. Servants saw him as too high to trust. He didn't belong anywhere. He was allowed into chambers most peasants never glimpsed, but only if he kept the laughs coming. The moment he asked for something serious, respect, protection, even just kindness, someone always snapped, "Mind your place, clown." He was a permanent outsider in his own home. Could he mimic a duke? Yes. Play the flute? Of course. Recite sonnets that made noble women sigh? Easily. But none of it earned him esteem. Talent wasn't the point. Talent, in fact, was a liability. Bramley could spin rhymes in 3 languages, yet the response was always, "Say that sheep thing again." He could craft biting satire wrapped in animal metaphors that would make Cicero weep but if it landed too hard. Someone threw a grape at him, or worse, accused him of being too clever. See, Bramley's genius was fine as long as it didn't outshine the room. If a noble sang a song, the room clapped like trained seals. If Bramley sang better, it got very quiet. If a baron told a joke, it was called bold. If Bramley delivered the same line, funnier it became inappropriate. The golden rule? Shine, but not too brightly. Be sharp, but not dangerous. Be brilliant, then immediately fall on your butt to remind everyone you're just the fool. It was exhausting, like dancing on a tightrope with knives in the dark. Many jesters were actually masters of their craft. Thinkers, musicians, acrobats, poets. But brilliance was only tolerated in a fool if it came dressed in idiocy. No one cheered your talent. They only roared when you slipped and looked stupid. And that's the twisted part. They laughed hardest when Bramley failed. When he missed a note, tripped mid-cartwheel, or spilled soup down his front, that's when the room howled. Because that confirmed their comfort. That he was an idiot in glitter, not a clever man in disguise. So even when Bramley was the most gifted in the room, his applause always came with a sneer. Now picture the royal banquet. Flaming roasts, goblets overflowing with wine, minstrels humming in corners, a glittering stage of overindulgence. And there's Bramley, already being targeted by half the room before dessert's even served. Dance for us, Jester. Imitate Sir Pimble and his wall-eyed glare. And he performs not because he wants to, but because the emotional state of 100 drunk aristocrats depends on him being okay with being slapped, mocked, groped, or publicly humiliated. He doesn't sit. He orbits the table like a cursed satellite of shame, weaving jokes into awkward pauses and handstands into political tension. But once the wine really starts flowing, that's when things got ugly. Someone yanked his hat over his eyes. Another demanded pig impressions. A chicken bone soared through the air. Because Bramley wasn't just there for amusement, was the release valve. Nobles couldn't insult each other without consequences, but they could tear into Bramley. And they did. They made jokes about his clothes, his voice, his parents, his worth. Not out of hate, but because it was safe. Mocking Bramley made them feel powerful, important, superior, like bullies who laugh hardest when no one dares laugh back. And Bramley, he took it, because that was the job. Because in the palace, silence was dangerous. Laughter kept tension at bay, and the second that laughter stopped, all eyes might turn to something else, something serious, and Bramley might get blamed for the silence. So yes, he was at every feast, but no one toasted him. He was the entertainment, not the honored guest, the breadstick of humor devoured and forgotten by dessert. And when the last goblet clinked and nobles drifted to their feather beds, Bramley dragged himself back to his scratchy corner behind the pantry, nursing bruises and a sore grin. By day, he was a jester, tossing jokes like daggers, juggling insults, surviving royal tantrums in rhyme. But by night, he was a weapon. Because here's the secret power of a fool. Everyone forgets you're listening. He glided from room to room like walking wallpaper. Nobles poured their hearts out in front of him. Servants vented while he carried their trays. Guests made offhand confessions they didn't realize were dangerous. Bramley heard it all. Not because he was nosy, because it saved his life. Sometimes the king would pull him aside and murmur, "Bramley, what did Bishop Aldor whisper to the envoy last night?" And Bramley had better know. If he didn't, he was disloyal. If he did, he was valuable, but also vulnerable. This was the cruel dance. The king wanted truth, but only the kind that flattered him. Bramley was expected to speak in clever riddles, mocking double meanings, and whispered verse that revealed who was cheating, betraying, or plotting all without drawing blood. He was the sharpest informant in the room, disguised as the dumbest man alive. They say the deadliest weapon in a royal court isn't a blade, it's a smirk hiding secrets, and no one wields it better than the one nobody suspects. Picture this, a juggler in tattered tights, a jester whose biggest threat seems to be a rubber chicken yet. Every noble in the hall gives them wary glances, because deep down, they know. They know that Silas, the court buffoon, is more dangerous than any knight in armor. Everyone laughs when he jests, but the moment he passes, whispers fall silent. Servants stop mid-sentence. Guards squint suspiciously, as if he's got poison tucked beneath his sleeves. And in a way, he does. His poison is knowledge. And in a court thick with lies and daggers, knowing the right secret is deadlier than a sword. Silas is always listening, always choosing when to share a little truth and when to tuck it under a gag about Lord Farnley's suspiciously large nose. Because in a castle teeming with treachery, the sharpest cut often comes from a joke. So he keeps the room in stitches, even when he's stitched up inside. His pet falcon just dropped dead? Too bad. The Empress wants a wisecrack about the Chancellor's latest toupee. Got a fever? Doesn't matter. Baron Rivern missed a shot while hunting wild boar, and now he needs a chuckle or someone's head is going on a spike. Heart shattered? Well, this is the Crown Prince's engagement gala, and tears don't match the tapestry. In this world, if your smile slips, you're as good as gone. Sadness? That's selfish. Rage? Treasonous? Tired? Lazy? If Silas isn't absurd and cheery, he's failing. No one wants to see his real face. They only want the performance. Because to them, he's not a soul with wounds. He's a noisy decoration. A spinning, singing, juggling piece of furniture that absorbs everyone's tantrums and reflects nothing back. Even if they hurl chicken legs at him mid-rant, he must grin like it's part of the act. He's danced through grief, coughed through flu, and held back sobs through royal banquets. All he ever wanted was to disappear behind a curtain for a few moments and cry. But there's no backstage here. No rest. Vulnerability doesn't match the outfit. And when someone does notice the lights dimmed in his eyes, it's not concern they offer, it's criticism. Not feeling funny today, Silas? Or worse, has the old jester finally snapped? Maybe it's time we got a livelier one. So what does Silas do? He turns agony into act. He builds a towering fortress of wit and sarcasm around the ache, never letting them see what's behind the bells. Because if they ever realize the fool is just a man, the fantasy breaks and so does his job. So yes, he has feelings. He's just learned to hide them under snappy lines and pratfalls, because that's what's expected. In the castle, emotions are a luxury, and jesters don't get luxuries. Now, the royals King Harvold especially are exactly known for their calm. One bad dream, a slightly burnt goose, or a sneezing envoy, and the entire court shifts moods like a summer storm. And guess who they blame when the king scowls into his goblet? That's right, Silas. He's not just entertainment, a living lightning rod, the emotional mood ring for the entire court. If the royal mood dips, the whispers start. Did the fool fail to amuse today? Maybe his timing's off. Did he say something inappropriate? Even if Silas stayed up all night pulling laughs from tired knights and anxious cooks, If the king wakes sour, it's somehow his fault. He becomes the unspoken scapegoat. Tensions rise, and everyone eyes him like he's the reason the negotiations crumbled. And then come the thinly veiled threats. Make me laugh, Jester. I'm in no mood. And they're not bluffing. One badly timed silence, and he's either in the stables with a shovel or in the dungeon with rats. And no one thanks him. If the king's laughter echoes, the wine gets credit. If he frowns, Silas takes the fall. His existence is a game of emotional whack-a-mole, where he's the molly only. Instead of getting bopped, he gets blamed. He is the castle's mood stabilizer, the royal Prozac in motley. And even with all this, he is not free, not in the slightest. While knights retire with honor and cooks pass down recipes, Silas will die with bells on. There's no exit ramp from being the jester. No career pivot, no golden handshake. Once labeled a fool, always a fool. Even if he's got more insight than the entire war council, they won't let him trade his cap for a crown. He could compose symphonies, solve political crises, master 5 dialects, but all anyone sees is the costume. They hear bells, and their minds shut off. And if he dares to leave, well, good luck to him. He's got no trade, no land, and no friends outside castle walls. Out there, he's not a clever entertainer. He's a weird, babbling stranger in mismatched clothes. Maybe someone takes pity, maybe he starves. But sooner or later, someone mutters, "Bring back the old fool. He was funny." And before his bed cools, they drag him back. Because he was never a man to them, just a joke. A sound, a painted grin, replaceable, forgettable. And yet, despite all that, Silas holds one power no one else does. In a room full of liars, he gets to speak the truth. Dukes flatter, priests hedge, maids lie to live, but the jester? He jabs the king with irony. He mocks the treasury's missing coin pile. He mimics the baron's greasy handshake deals. And they laugh not because they don't understand, but because it's safer to pretend it's just comedy. But Silas knows better. Every punchline is a political landmine. Every joke a balancing act between being clever and being dead. He's the court's conscience dressed in patchwork, pointing out the naked emperor with a cartwheel. But truth cuts, and if it cuts too deep, the same laughter that saved him yesterday could send him to the gallows tomorrow. In the end, he's the court's emotional mirror, polished, bright, and cracked. He can reflect what no one else dares say. But if his truth stings too much, they'll smash the mirror without a second thought. Because sometimes, the only person brave enough to say what's real is the one no one's willing to listen to. And when the time comes for Silas to go whenever that may be, he won't be mourned. His last breath won't echo through the halls he once filled with laughter. No statue, no song. Maybe a passing mention by the butcher, "Remember that fool who danced like a goat?" Or a dusty drawer yields a rusted bell, and no one remembers who wore it. Because in the end, he wasn't real to them. Just noise. A moment. A disposable flicker of color they tossed aside when the next jester stepped in. The same gift that lets you vanish behind a well-timed punchline is what guarantees the world forgets you ever existed. You don't marry. You don't pass your name down. No land to your name. No title engraved in stone. You're the one who inflates everyone else's ego and yet leaves behind nothing of your own. Even the steward Edric, who once laughed so hard he nearly fell down the stairs when you mimicked the bishop's nasal hymn, won't bother placing a single flower on your grave. If you're even given a grave. See, people like you jesters like Rowenden get the churchyard. Not enough prayers, too many gags, no holy soil for those who made mockery their religion. You lived for the applause, but applause echoes once and vanishes. And when your last joke fades, the corridors grow quiet until another jester laces up your shoes. Sure, Rowan made kings cackle, made earls forget their debts, made noblemen spill wine through their noses. He made misery momentarily forget itself. But when his candle flickers out, there's no fanfare. No teary crowd, just a stillness no one notices. And maybe, if the wind's just right, a faint jingle no one remembers. To the elite of the medieval court, the jester was entertainment laughter therapy in an age of paranoia and iron. But if you look closer, you'll realize Rowan wasn't just there to juggle apples and impersonate the squire's stutter. He was a walking paradox, lowborn but allowed to taunt the throne, powerless but permitted to speak the truth no one else dared, mocked yet somehow feared. He stood spinning at the center of ceremonies, not to be praised but to be read, because Rowan was a mirror in motley. His jests revealed secrets, his slapstick cloaked subversion. Every laugh carried attention, because hidden in every tumble and rhyme was a truth no one wanted to face. The court guffawed until the laughter got too real, then silence, because suddenly they realized, this fool understands us better than we'd like, and that made him more than a performer. He was a symbol, a reminder that the high and mighty could be humbled, that truth wrapped in giggles could draw blood, that humor was a dagger with a velvet handle. In a society obsessed with order and protocol, the fool was the one glorious breach in the pattern. That's what made him indispensable and dangerous. He walked among dukes and bishops not because they loved him, but because they needed a reminder of their own absurdity. Rowan was the one thing that could expose the emperor's nakedness and survive until he couldn't, because the cruelest joke was always on him. He traded dignity for delight, gave up peace of mind so the highborn could chuckle. His brilliance was buried under banana peels. His insight passed off as nonsense. He might have been the sharpest mind in the kingdom, but all they ever heard were bells. And still, centuries later, we remember him not as a buffoon, but as something deeper, something cracked and complex, because the jester wasn't just comic relief, he was a cautionary tale. A warning that sometimes the only one brave enough to say what matters is the one everyone's busy mocking. Long before theater meant spotlights and curtain calls, it began as ritual chaos drenched in wine and masks. Before actors bowed, they were possessed. And the stage? It wasn't a stage at all. It was sacred ground. Ancient Greece, 6th century BCE. The city of Eleutheria throws a wild springtime bash, the festival of Dionysos. Picture it sacrificed goats, goblets overflowing, flutes screeching, and in the middle of it all, performance, raw, divine, and frenzied. This wasn't theater. This was invocation. Men gathered in choruses, masked and entranced, chanting ancient hymns dithyrambics in praise of Dionysos, the god of madness and drama. These weren't actors, they were vessels of chaos. Their voices were not their own. Their dances blurred the line between ecstasy and prayer. And then a rebel steps forward. Thespis, around 534 BCE. He breaks away from the chorus, steps into the light, and becomes a character, not a vessel, a persona. One man speaking lines that aren't his own, performing as someone else. In that moment, the idea of acting is born. That's why performers today still call themselves thespians. It must have felt like magic or heresy. One man against a sea of voices. And the people? They couldn't get enough. From there, Greek theater evolves. Visionaries like Aeschylus and Sophocles turn this spiritual frenzy into structured storytelling. More actors, real dialogue, conflicts, drama, and always at its core ritual. These plays were performed in amphitheaters carved into hillsides, colossal arenas like the Theater of Dionysos in Athens, holding thousands. Citizens, from merchants to magistrates, packed the seats. For them, these performances weren't just art. They were duty, religion, truth in disguise. And at the heart of this ancient spectacle masks, actors, all male, would embody multiple characters using oversized, expressive masks. Sorrow, rage, innocence, dreadful, exaggerated, so even the furthest spectator could feel it. These weren't just props, they were portals. Behind the masks, voices reigned supreme. No microphones, no fancy lighting, just breath and body, thundered across stone and sky. Tragedy reigned. Themes of betrayal, war, divine injustice, and destiny painted the stage in emotional fire. Aeschylus added a second actor, Sophocles added a third. Euripides gave characters rawness, flesh, and flaw. Their characters didn't just perform, they bled. Oedipus, Antigone, Medea names still whispered today because those stories cut deep. They held up mirrors to fear, ego, and gods who played with humans like dice. But Greek tragedy wasn't a funeral march. It was civic glory, a spiritual Olympics. Whole cities attended. Rich patrons funded the productions not out of generosity but out of obligation. The stage was now a sacred battleground, and the mask, a weapon of revelation. While tragedy asked, "Why must humans suffer?" Greek comedy burst onto the scene asking, "Who let Zeus out without a babysitter?" By the late 5th century BCE, as Athens flexed its cultural muscles, comedy arrived like an angry younger sibling, loud, obscene, brilliant. Tragedy wore robes. Comedy mooned the audience. No target was safe. Not the gods. Not the politicians. Especially not the audience. Aristophanes was its wild master, the high priest of satire. His plays weren't just witty, they were reckless. Lysistrata, for instance, is about women weaponizing celibacy to end a war. Imagine a play so bold it mocks the ruling class, skewers religious hypocrisy, and ridicules society's worst habits while the crowd cheers. Comedy wasn't just a laugh, it was resistance in disguise. Truth shouted through jokes. Theater had become the voice of the people, raw, honest, divine. The curtain never really closed in ancient Greece, it simply shifted moods. One moment, you were sobbing into your cloak over the tragic demise of Eleonora. The next, you were clutching your belly in laughter as a chorus of breakdancing sausages roasted a corrupt magistrate on stage. Comedy followed tragedy like wine, follows dinner unexpectedly necessary. At festivals like the Grand City Dionysa, laughter came right after loss. The audience barely dried their tears before the masks returned, this time even wilder. Faces painted in grotesque exaggeration, eyes popping, noses stubbed, and male anatomy, well, comically massive. If you were in the last row, 50 yards back, they still wanted to make sure you'd choke on your figs laughing. The costumes were padded and absurd, wigs defied gravity, and the chorus? Anything from croaking frogs to buzzing wasps to floating cloud siege ensemble more absurd than the last. But behind the farce, there was fire. Greek comedy wasn't all pratfalls and potty humor. It was rebellion in costume. Aristophanes, the grandmaster of comedic anarchy, went after warmongers, pseudo-intellectuals, and even other playwrights with pinpoint venom. His play The Clouds mocked Socrates so brutally, some historians believe it helped sour public opinion against the philosopher, planting seeds of suspicion that would later lead to his trial. But comedy changed with the times. As Athens aged, the sharp satire softened. By the 4th century BCE, Greek comedy shifted focus. The new flavor? Domestic chaos. Mistaken identities, mischievous servants outsmarting pompous masters, tangled romances. Playwrights like Menandros penned stories that laid the groundwork for everything from Roman farces to modern sitcoms. Greek comedy was never just entertainment. It was the city talking to itself through song, dance, disguise, and double entendre. Where tragedy asked, "What's our fate?" Comedy replied, "Isn't it hilarious how we pretend we control it?" Then came Rome. The Greeks handed the stage to the Romans, and the Romans made it thunder. They didn't just inherit drama. They put it in marble amphitheaters, filled them with thousands of cheering citizens, and said, "Louder, bloodier, funnier." Theater in ancient Rome wasn't an art, it was an event. The early Roman stage leaned heavily on Greek translations, with playwrights like Livius Andronicus and Plautus taking old scripts, giving them a Latin twist, and dialing the humor to 11. Slapstick ruled. Physical comedy thrived. Stories spun around mistaken identities, absurd misunderstandings, and characters dumber than a bag of bricks. It was fast, crude, and unapologetically funny. Plautus and later Terence refined the format into a comic formula that still echoes today. Sassy slaves outwitting pompous masters, clueless lovers falling into traps, and fathers having breakdowns. It wasn't subtle, but it was sharp, mocking Roman greed, vanity, and the eternal grind of climbing the social ladder. Roman tragedy, though? a whole different beast. While Greek tragedies wrestled with fate and gods through philosophical poetry, Roman tragedies, especially those penned by Seneca, were violent, visceral, and downright bone-chilling. Seneca's Thyestes includes a dinner scene where a man unknowingly feasts on his own children. Yes, really. And yet, even this wasn't enough drama for Roman audiences. Theater had to compete with gladiator fights and wild animal shows, so producers upped the ante. Trapdoors opened to reveal fire. Cranes lifted actors skyward like gods descending. Music blared, often drowning out the actors themselves. And in some rare, horrific case, executions weren't staged. They were real. Blood on the stage, screams in the stands. Only in Rome could a play double as a death sentence. For emperors like Augustus and Nero, theater wasn't just spectacle, it was propaganda. Augustus used it to promote imperial ideals. Nero? He fancied himself a leading man. He'd take to the stage, perform hour after hour, and if you dared yawn or leave, well, good luck keeping your head. Roman theater had evolved. It wasn't about catharsis anymore. It was about domination, owning the crowd, the moment, the message. But east of Rome, in lands less soaked in wine and violence, theater was taking a different shape. In ancient India, drama didn't erupt from festival chaos. It unfolded from sacred texts, deep meditation, and spiritual yearning. Theater wasn't just expression, it was enlightenment in action. The foundation of Indian theater lies in the Natya Shastra, an ancient Sanskrit treatise attributed to the sage Bharata, dated somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE. This wasn't a script guide. It was a divine instruction manual. It claimed theater was born when the gods, seeking to uplift humanity, created a new medium that could educate, entertain, and elevate the soul. The Natya Shastra covers everything: how stages should be built, how actors should move, how emotions should be stirred. It introduced rasath, essence of feeling. Every scene was designed to provoke a specific emotional response, from love, Sringara, to sorrow, Karuna, from fury, Radra, to awe, Adbhuta. The goal wasn't entertainment, it was transformation. Performances were elaborate but meticulous. Actors trained for years in vocal technique, stylized movement, and mudrashan gestures rich with symbolism. Dialogue was chanted, not spoken. And the stories? They came from the epics Mahabharata, Ramayana, weaving myth, morality, and magic. Kalidasa, one of India's earliest dramatists, wrote works like Shakuntala, now considered masterpieces of world literature. His plays weren't just beautiful, they were revered. Audiences expected not just a narrative, but a journey, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. Theater in India didn't divide elite and folk. Classical Sanskrit performances coexisted with village dramas, shadow puppetry, and regional dance theater forms like Kathakali and Yakshagana. Each came with its own rhythm, costumes, and musical pulse. Where Rome screamed for spectacle and Greece aimed for civic catharsis, Indian theater aimed for balancia, harmony of mind, body, and spirit. The stage wasn't just for storytelling, it was for awakening. And in the East, another tradition was blooming. Chinese theater didn't explode onto the scene. It unfolded like silk, gradual, intricate, and deliberate. It began in sacred ceremonies, danced through dynasties, and grew into a refined art form as layered as a scholar's robe. 3,000 years ago, in the Zhou dynasty, masked rituals called nuo were performed to cleanse spaces and ward off spirits. These weren't comedies. They were solemn, powerful performances blending music, dance, and divination. Over time, these ceremonies absorbed story, humor, and character. By the Tang dynasty, a true theatrical form had emerged. Emperor Xuanzong even created the Père Gardena Royal Acting Academy. Its graduates were so revered that even today, actors are still called children of the Pear Garden. It was under Mongol rule, during the Yuan dynasty, that Chinese drama soared, censorship relaxed, and Zaju poetic drama with structured acts and interludes became popular. Strong female leads were common. often played by women in exceptional rarity in global theater. Enter Guan Hanqing, the Shakespeare of Yuan drama. His plays like The Injustice to Do a blended lyrical beauty, social commentary, and moral crisis. Audiences read movement like they read lines. Everything mattered. A sleeve raised, a glance held. The stage was sparse. The performance was full. These roots eventually bloomed into Chinese opera. By the 18th century, Peking opera, Jingju, had crystallized into a stunning art form, extravagant costumes, martial acrobatics, falsetto singing, and a symbolic visual language. Every color, every motion meant something. The stage might be bare, but your mind filled it with mountains, rivers, and courts of emperors. Unlike Western theater, Chinese opera wasn't trying to imitate life. It was trying to express its essence. Storytelling isn't just about tales, it's about transmitting spirit. It's how civilizations preserved their heartbeat, passed down truths, and taught generations how to see the world. In ancient Asia, theater didn't explode. With noise, it emerged with reverence, with ritual, with a whisper rather than a roar. In Japan, performance began not with spectacle, but with stillness. In a world where silence was sacred, the oldest surviving form of Japanese theater, No, was born. Emerging in the 14th century, No was less entertainment and more sacred ceremony, something crafted for the soul rather than the crowd. It evolved from earlier folk dances like Dengaku and Sarugaku, comic skits and spiritual chants performed in fields and temples, enjoyed by both peasants and priests. But it was the legendary father-son duo, Kanzei Kanami and his son Zeami, who transformed these raw elements into something transcendent. Zeami, part performer, part philosopher, gave No its breath. He wrote treatises that delved into aesthetics like Why, Gen, a mysterious beauty that hides more than it shows. He believed real power lay in the unseen, the felt but not explained. To watch a No performance is not to be dazzled, it's to be lulled into a trance. Each act is a blend of chant, movement, poetry, and music. The actors glide across the stage with the deliberation of ghosts. Their dialogue isn't spoken, it's sung, accompanied by a flute and drums. There's no illusion of real life here. What you see is dreamlike, almost spiritual. You're not watching a play, you're listening to a soul speak. And often, quite literally, the soul is the story. No plays frequently feature spirits, fallen warriors, grieving lovers, mad widows, lost monks. These aren't tales of action. They are meditations on memory, loss, and time. The main actor, the Shite, wears a carved wooden mask. It doesn't move, but tilted an inch, and the emotion shifts. These masks aren't props, they're sacred vessels. The stage is minimal, a polished wooden floor and a lone pine tree painted at the back. But within this simplicity lies deep choreography. Every rustle of a robe, every shuffle of the foot is loaded with intention. Time itself seems to slow. Nothing is rushed. Every moment breathes. No thrived under the patronage of the samurai class. It wasn't for the masses. It was for introspection, for gazing into the void and seeing your reflection. Even now, centuries later, No remains virtually unchanged, a living bridge between worlds, between the seen and unseen. While elites watched men in masks whisper eternity, something else stirred in the shadows: puppets. Across Asia, puppetry was no child's game. It was myth, politics, and memory, wrapped in silk and string. The lifeless became vessels for truths that lips dared not speak. In Indonesia, especially in Java and Bali, puppet theater became sacred through wayang kulit, or shadow puppetry. The puppets, flat and delicate, made from buffalo hide, were held behind a screen and lit by an oil lamp. The result, flickering silhouettes, whole worlds born from shadows. At the center was the dalang, the puppet master. But he wasn't just manipulating figures. He was a priest, comedian, philosopher, and oracle. With one voice, he played dozens of characters from the Mahabharata and Ramayana. The performance might last the entire night, the shadows dancing to the beat of a gamelan orchestra. This wasn't just storytelling. It was ritual. Wayang was performed at births, deaths, and royal ceremonies. Each puppet was a symbol of virtue, vice, karma, and destiny. Meanwhile, in Japan, another puppet tradition evolved, bunraku. Unlike wayang, bunraku puppets were large, stunningly lifelike, and operated in full view by 3 puppeteers. One for the head and right arm, one for the left, and one for the legs. It takes 10 years before a puppeteer is allowed to control the head. The result? Uncanny realism. A puppet woman clutches her robe in sorrow. A warrior kneels before death. But the soul of bunraku comes not from the puppet but from the voice. The entire narrative is delivered by a chanter, seated beside a shamisen player. His voice rumbles, weeps, soars. He becomes every character, his breath weaving emotions into the air while the puppets reflect his storm. Why did puppetry flourish? Because puppets could speak truth. In repressive societies, they could mock rulers, question gods, explore forbidden love or vengeance without consequence. After all, it wasn't a person criticizing the emperor, just a piece of wood. From ink-black shadows to spotlighted dolls, puppets mirrored our fears, longings, and truths. They were never silent. They were just more honest than we dared to be. Theater's journey didn't vanish in dust. It thundered forward, shaping every story we tell. Its pulse beats through ruins, and ruins beat in our hearts. The Greeks gave us bones, structure, conflict, arcs. The 3-act play? Thank Aeschylus. The doomed hero? That's Sophocles whispering across time. The 4th wall? The Greeks were already playing with it while building democracy. The Romans handed down power through pageantry. Their amphitheaters became blueprints for modern arenas. Their slapstick comedies of mistaken identity laid the path for sitcoms and farce. But the East held a different flame. Indian theater, through rasa, gave us emotional truthiage scene crafted to stir not just the mind, but the soul. Its legacy ripples through Bollywood, classical dance, and literature even now. The Natya Shastra is still quoted in screenwriting rooms and dance studios. Chinese opera, with its vibrant makeup and movement, shaped visual storytelling itself. Martial arts cinema, rooted in opera's grace, choreographed combat, echoes of ancient stage battles. Color and gesture became narrative. Japanese no and bunraku remain sacred. Minimalist, haunting, timeless, they've influenced everyone from Kurosawa to avant-garde Western directors. Their impact lies not in grandeur, but in silence. And the puppets? They've multiplied. From shadow plays in Southeast Asia to animated avatars on TikTok. From Sesame Street to surreal performance art, the spirit of puppetry, the power to give voice to the silent, remains magnetic. But maybe the most enduring truth about theater is this: we are all performers. We long to be seen. We watch, we mimic, we project, we imagine. We slip into stories to feel things we can't explain. Whether it's a 6th century chant, a 3D movie, or a goofy skit online, we're chasing connection. We want meaning. So next time you press play on a stage, a screen, or a scroll, remember, you're not just watching a performance. You're hearing a sacred echo. She wasn't born to play the game, she was born to break the board. While most royal daughters were groomed for silk and submission, Kyla was raised in fire, carved by the clash of sword and legacy. Her birth in the palace of Veradon didn't mark her as a pawn. It marked her as a weapon. Daughter to King Forian of Macedar and Queen Ilaria of the Irath tribes, Kyla was a paradox from her first breath. On one side, strategy and steel. On the other, wilderness and war cries. Unlike the court ladies who learned to curtsy and charm, Kayla learned to ride bareback through mountain passes and draw a blade before most girls learned to dance. She shared blood with Legend Shaft's sister to the famed Alarion, known to history as the Sunday of the East, the boy who would become myth. But Kayla had no time for myths. She trained in shadows, listening at war councils, studying the politics that ruined kingdoms long before swords were drawn. The palace knew Alarion would inherit the crown. His mother, Empress Velisa, wove alliances like spiderwebs. The generals adored him. The scholars tutored him like he was Olympus reborn. But Kyla? She was a whisper in the halls, a blade waiting for its moment. She didn't chase glory, she studied it. While Illyrian stormed into Persia, Kaela remained behind, eyes wide open. She learned the Empire's true language: silence, suspicion, and soft betrayal. Rumors whispered of her skill in battle, her ability to lead men twice her age, but Kaela preferred it that way. Let them dismiss her. Let them forget the wolf in the drawing room. And when the time came, Kaela chose her battlefield. Not the eastern sands, but the western mountains of her Irathian kin. Cloaked in armor, she rode at the head of her forces, reclaiming not just territory but a legacy. Her victory wasn't symbolic, it was strategic, real, bloody, personal. She didn't just win, she conquered the myth that women must lead from behind curtains. Kaela's war wasn't for glory, it was for proof. She was no court decoration, she was a general. While Illyrian expanded east, Kaela built power in the west, not borrowed, not inherited, but forged. She became a queen in all but title. And when the Empire's heart began to fracture with Illyrian's absence, Kaela saw what others missed: a kingdom's future up for grabs. But she wasn't playing just for herself anymore. She had a daughter, Arenya, born of her union with Lord Myros, a noble with thin ambition but noble blood. The marriage was political, the child was purpose. Kaela poured her own fire into the girl, training her not as a princess but as a sovereign. Rhetoric, strategy, combat. Kaela sharpened Arenya like a blade. And she had a plan. Illyrian had no heir. His empire stretched thin, and the throne sat on shaking legs. Kaela intended to place her daughter beside King Arian, Illyrian's half-brother, legitimate in name, fragile in mind. If Arenya married Arian, Kaela would become the power behind the throne. It wasn't ambition, it was preservation, of lineage, of stability, of Macedar itself. But power in a woman's hands rarely stays unchallenged. The regents, especially Vadran, Illyrian's ruthless general-turned-regent, saw the storm coming. Kaela wasn't just a widow. She was a warrior with influence, with the loyalty of soldiers and the love of a people starving for leadership. So when Kaela and Arenya crossed into Illyria to meet Arian, they were intercepted by forces led by Malik, Vadran's brother. Kaela was unarmed but unshaken. Some say she demanded audience with the king. Others claim she tried to turn the soldiers then and there. What we know is this: the order had already been signed. Kaela was assassinated on the road not for treason, but for potential. The Empire didn't weep, it recoiled. The soldiers who watched her fall turned on her killers. The people remembered. The regents backpedaled. Vadran, desperate to contain the fury, allowed the marriage between Arenya and Arian to proceed. But the cost had already been paid. Kaela, daughter of kings, war-forged strategist, the woman who saw the cracks before anyone else was gone. Her armor was off, but her plan endured. Her daughter, now queen, her legacy, undeniable. Kaela's death was meant to be an end, a silencing, a removal of a threat dressed in royal silks and veiled defiance, but instead it became a spark that ignited something far greater than vengeance. It ignited a legacy. Her daughter, born in shadow but raised in fire, stood at the edge of grief and transformed. She did not mourn in the quiet corridors of the palace. She did not retreat into widow's garb or whisper prayers into a locked chamber. She burned, with fury, with clarity, with the blood of Kaela still echoing in her veins. Arenya, as she had once been called, died that day with her mother. In her place rose Velanira. The name was not chosen lightly. It was an invocation and echo of the old Myrian queens who ruled before men laid claim to lineage. It was not a cosmetic change, it was a challenge. A name that rang like a war drum through the corridors of Macedar. She was no longer the quiet consort, no longer the flower beside the throne. Velanira did not kneel beside King Arian as a symbol of support. She stood as his equal or more. For Arian, fragile in mind and spirit, drifted further from lucidity with each passing moon. The court pitied him, tolerated him, But it was Velanira they began to fear. The regents Vedran and Tiphys, and the calcified remnants of Arian's advisory circle, had anticipated a silent, obedient queen, a ceremonial presence, a ribbon to wrap around the broken package of monarchy. Instead, they got a queen in armor. Velanira did not wield a sword, but she understood that words could cut deeper. She walked the barracks in military garb, not silk, but leather and steel. She addressed soldiers by name, invoked battles their fathers had fought, promised not wealth, but meaning, order, strength. She spoke of Macedarian pride as something sacred, something lost, and worth bleeding to reclaim. To the veterans of Valerian's campaigns, she was familiar, not in face, but in fire, in the uncompromising steadiness of her voice, in the way she held her shoulders like a commander, not a courtier. In her, they saw Kyla, and in Kyla, they had once seen victory. Velanira's rise came in the eye of a storm. The wars of succession were tearing the empire apart. Alarian's death had left a crater in the chain of command, and from it, generals clawed at each other like starving wolves. Provinces seceded overnight. Border fortresses turned against the capital. Alliances shattered in the span of a single conversation. Crowns were handed out like dice rolled, lost, and replaced. Velanira had no army, no province to claim, no fleet to command. But she had the throne, what was left of it, and she had the capital. For a while, she began to rule not from behind a veil, but from the marble steps of the palace. She addressed the city, invoked the names of fallen heroes, demanded loyalty not for herself, but for the survival of a civilization on the brink. Polivar, the regent, did not take kindly to her intrusion. He had counted on her ignorance, her mourning, her irrelevance. Instead, she met him in council chambers with counter-decrees and legal precedent. She invoked laws long buried under patriarchal custom. She maneuvered through the court like a seasoned strategist, matching smiles with steel beneath every word. Polivar's hand faltered. His allies whispered. The balance began to shift. But no kingdom unravels quietly. A new player returned to the boardroom. Polivar, welcomed like a ghost, Queen Valisa, Alarian's mother, exiled once, now returned with venom in her voice, and loyalty flowing back to her like blood to a heart. Valisa was royalty as weapon, cloaked in sanctity, armored in divine right. She bore the old standards, the old prayers, the old lost laws that carved a woman's power only from the bones of her husband or son. To Valisa, Velanira was heresy made flesh. Their conflict was more than political. It was generational, elemental. Velanira represented change. Valisa embodied the past. And the empire chose its past. Velanira marched to meet Valisanat in a formal battle, but in the deadly chess of power, she moved troops under borrowed banners, attempted alliances with half-loyal lords. She offered pardons to dissenters and incentives to wavering captains. But betrayal crept in like smoke. The night before her planned unification address, 3 of her commanders defected. The 4th delayed his march. When Valisa's forces arrived, marching beneath the old crest, singing the old hymns, Velanira's army wavered, and then it collapsed. The capture was swift. There was no battle, just silence, the kind of silence that comes before the blade. Velanira and Arian were taken from the capital in chains. The people were told it was justice, but everyone knew the truth. This wasn't about crime. It was about control, about extinguishing a fire before it became a blaze. Valisa issued her sentence not with sorrow, but certainty. Arian was executed publicly to demonstrate the restoration of order. Velanira was given no such luxury. Her death was private, surgical, controlled. She was imprisoned and offered a dagger laced with toxin. Die by your own hand, or watch your remaining allies flayed in public. She took the dagger, not out of surrender but to protect those still loyal. They called it justice. It was vengeance dressed in velvet. But death could not contain what Velanira had become. Her speeches survived past, in whispers between soldiers, carved into the undersides of helmets. In exile camps, her name became a chant. Velonira lives became a battle cry among those who remembered Kaila's fire. Coins were minted in secret, bearing her profile, not in silver or gold, but in iron, the metal of war, the metal of defiance. She became more than a queen. She became a question. What if she had lived? What if she had ruled? Kaila and Velonira are rarely placed beside the Empire's great men Ilarion, Forian, even the cruel brilliance of Velisa. The scrolls call them consorts, rebels, interruptions. But they were more. They were the Empire's lost heartbeat. Kaila was not a silk-draped queen sipping from jeweled goblets. She was a commander, a strategist. She led the Arath campaigns and returned not in triumphal processions, but on wounded steeds with bloodied armor and unbroken eyes. Her soldiers adored her. Her enemies feared her. Velonira was no different. She wore command like a second skin. She did not wait for power to trickle down. She reached for it, gripped it, and wielded it with precision. And that more than any rebellion, more than any speech, was what terrified the old guard. She did not seek to decorate the throne. She sought to redefine it. Their executions were not judicial acts. They were political exorcisms. But their lives? They were blueprints. Examples. Proof that the crown did not belong to gender. It belonged to will. In another timeline, one not ruled by fear, Kayla would have stood beside Ilarion as a co-sovereign, not a subordinate. Velonira would have inherited a united empire and ruled it into a golden age. Instead, they were struck down not for failing, but for being too effective. Their power wasn't imagined. It was real. And history written by those it threatened chose to forget. Scrolls were edited, statues removed, stories rewritten. Royal genealogies listed Arion as a lone monarch. Kaila became a tragic wife. Velonira, a misguided rebel. Footnotes in the saga of male conquest. But memory, like fire, finds a way to survive. There are still murals in ruined cities depicting a woman with Kayla's posture sword at her side, eyes unflinching. There are still poems, unsigned and smuggled, that speak of a queen with flame in her voice. There are still little girls named Velonira, even in provinces where her name is outlawed. Kaila and Velonira were not erased because they were weak. They were erased because they were unforgettable. And history only forgets what threatens to change it. History tried to silence them, reduce their ambition to arrogance, their legacy to mere rumor. But the shards of Kaila and Velonira's defiance still glint in the dark corners of empire, in torn scrolls, in the hush of soldiers who bore witness to their murders and knew what they had lost. Not queens, not consorts forces of nature. What endures, above all, is their will. Neither Kaila nor Velonira needed crowns to lead. They were authority written not in titles, but in battle cries, dust-swept armor, and rooms that stilled when they spoke. Their power was not passed down like a ring. It was honed in bruises, strategy, and sheer presence. Kaila's mere existence challenged the myth that only men could command history. Velonira stood before legions, draped in royal regalia, speaking with the poise of a commander, not a trembling figurehead. Even now, their names beg the question, what if? What if Velonia had lived longer? Could she have held Macedar together? What if Kaila had led beside Ilarion could? They have forged an empire worthy of its promise. We will never know. And that possibility, that unbearable maybe, is itself a form of legacy. Modern scholars have begun to unearth them, brushing aside the dust, pulling them from the footnotes of history, not as curiosities, but as protagonists, not as myths, but as real women who carved space in a world that had none. Kaila and Velonira didn't survive their empire, but they rattled it. Their echoes aren't the wails of ghosts. They're the drumbeat of power that never asked for permission. Their crowns were taken, their voices nearly erased. But the spark remains, alive in every story that dares to ask, what did we lose when we buried their names? Before black belts, blockbuster fights, or heroes flying through wire-stunt duels, martial arts was born in silence between ritual and raw survival. Across ancient civilizations, Fighting was never just about self-defense. It was sacred. It was identity. Long before parchment recorded kings, people were already striking, grappling, and sparring. But as time passed, necessity evolved into discipline. Survival sharpened into philosophy. And combat became art. Take early hunter-siege leap, dodge, and thrust wasn't just movement. It was muscle memory. Training for war before the concept of warfare even had rules. When the enemies vanished, the motions remained, passed from father to son, from clan to tribe, until fighting itself became a tradition. In the Indus Valley, 4,000-year-old seals show figures frozen in stances still used in martial training today. In Africa, tribal wrestling wasn't just a rite of passage, it was a map to manhood. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, hand-to-hand strikes were as refined as spear formations. These weren't barbaric scuffles. They were physical language. To fight was to speak the body's truth. And always, those movements held meaning. Strike like a lion. Evade like a serpent. A warrior's kick was more than foresight, was myth in motion. Festivals, funerals, even harvest rites echoed with these sacred gestures. In many cultures, a warrior's sword was buried with them not as a weapon, but as a name. Because to wield combat wasn't just to survive, it was to become. In the lush hills of southern India, that philosophy crystallized into one of the world's oldest martial arts, Kalaripayattu. Rooted in Kerala over 3,000 years ago, Kalaripayattu blended fighting, healing, and inner balance. The word Kalari means training ground, Payattu, to fight. But this wasn't just about striking, it was about transformation. Legend credits the warrior sage Parashurama with its creation, he who reclaimed the coast from the sea. Under his vision, martial art became sacred path. Young warriors trained their bodies before touching weapons. They studied breath, learned Ayurvedic healing, and flowed through routines like dancers of battle. These patterns, known as May Payattu, conditioned not just muscle, but mind. Inspired by animals, the peacock's grace, the snake's stealth, the lion's rage, each sequence was a living prayer. Wooden staffs, curved blades, the lethal Urumi, a whip-like sword that flowed like silk and struck like lightning. But every step was matched with humility. Kalaripayattu taught restraint, taught compassion. You didn't win by breaking your enemy. You won by mastering yourself. And when colonizers arrived, first the Portuguese, then the British, they tried to erase it. But it went underground, hidden in dance, whispered in rituals. Today, it still thrives not as a relic, but as a living legacy of body, spirit, and story. To the world, martial arts often conjures one image, Kung Fu. But in China, Gong Fu means far more than combat. It's mastery through discipline, be it in calligraphy, cooking, or war. And its spiritual heart, Shaolin. In the serene Song Mountains, the Shaolin Temple became more than a sanctuary, it became a forge. Legend says in the 5th century CE, a monk named Bodhidharma arrived from India. He found the monks frail from meditation, their spirits strong but bodies weak. So he introduced movement fluid, intentional, breath-linked. These forms became Shaolin Kung Fu. Each motion mirrored nature, the tiger's strength, the crane's elegance, the snake's fluidity. Kung Fu was not brute strength, it was philosophy in flight. Each strike was an extension of qi, life energy. A warrior wasn't trained to destroy, he was trained to balance. Elsewhere, Taoist monks in the Wudang Mountains created softer styles Tai Chi, built on yielding instead of resisting, on absorbing force and redirecting it, like water, always flowing, never breaking. These styles taught that power wasn't about foresight, it was about alignment. Kung Fu wasn't merely tradition, it was resilience. It endured dynasties, revolutions, and censorship, because at its heart was a truth that the greatest opponent is imbalance within, and only through discipline, ethics, and grace could the warrior become whole. In the arenas of ancient Greece, under the gaze of gods, there was a martial art so complete it terrified even seasoned hoplites. It was called pancration, meaning all powers. No swords, no shields. Just flesh and will. Introduced in the Olympics in 648 BCE, pancration blended wrestling and striking. It was brutal, raw, unfiltered. Fighters choked, punched, grappled. They broke bones. The only limits? No eye gouging, no biting. Everything else was allowed. But don't mistake it for chaos. Pancration was discipline, precision. Warriors trained with tactical focus, developing not just brawn, but control. Because true mastery wasn't in domination, it was in deciding how to dominate. It wasn't for sport, it was for the gods. Control, not chaos. Strategy, not slaughter. That was the creed of the ancient pancratiist. These Greek warriors didn't win by brute force alone. They mastered the mechanics of the body. How to pivot a strike, when to snap a joint, where to land a blow that silences breath and bends will. They weren't wild. They were wired for war, trained to find clarity in carnage. Inside the palaestra, where marble floors soaked in sweat and the air hummed with grunts and grit, they sculpted their craft. Gymnastics and grappling, strikes and submission holds. The pancratiist was admired not just for muscle, but for nerve, the mental steel to endure pain and keep going. And their art wasn't confined to sport. Pancration was the soldier's last resort. When the spear shattered, the sword dropped, and the shield cracked, what remained was the body. Close combat, no armor, no mercy. Warriors trained in pancration because when war stripped them bare, this was their edge. Legend surrounded them. One tale tells of Eryxion of Phigalia, who died mid-match with his opponent still in a chokehold. Though lifeless, Eryxion's grip never loosened. His foe conceded, and Eryxion was declared victor posthumously, a dead man crowned in olive, the ultimate symbol of pancration, absolute resolve, even in death. But like all ancient arts, it faded. When Rome swallowed Greece, gladiators replaced disciplined fighters. Spectacle drowned skill. Later, as empires shifted and paganism gave way, pancration slipped into shadows, but its DNA lingers in today's full-contact fighting, from MMA to street defense. Modern warriors train with echoes of Eryxion's creed. If everything is lost, what remains is you. How you move, how you think, how you endure. When we picture ancient Egypt, we see pharaohs in gold, pyramids kissed by sunlight, and gods with the heads of falcon. But beneath the divine iconography lay a military machine where martial skill wasn't just function, it was faith. The earliest records of Egyptian combat aren't written. They're painted etched on the tombs of Beni Hassan. Over 400 illustrations of grappling, throws, and holds dating back to 2000 BCE. These weren't doodles, they were manuals. Proof that wrestling wasn't a pastime, it was a passion. Young noblemen trained from childhood. To fight was to align with Ma'at, the divine balance of the universe. Soldiers weren't just defenders of land, they were guardians of order. Their arsenal extended beyond bare hands. They mastered Tatiba stick-fighting art performed to rhythm, both beautiful and brutal. They wielded bows, spears, axes, and blades. They fought in chariots, launching arrows with lethal accuracy at full gallop. Mobile martial artists before the term existed. Even Egypt's gods were warriors. Horus, the avenger of Osiris, was a combat deity. Pharaohs modeled their victories after celestial battles. War wasn't just survival, it was sanctified. Though Egypt's martial systems didn't survive as formal styles, their energy remains in symbols, dances, and ceremonial rites. In Egypt, to fight wasn't only to win, it was to preserve the cosmos. Before the word samurai ever echoed in battle, Japan's martial spirit was taking shape quietly, deliberately in its forested valleys and storm-battered coasts. In the Yayoi and Kofun periods, warriors fought not with art but instinct, stone-tipped arrows, sharpened spears, swift, brutal techniques born from necessity. Fighting was tribal, personal, a test of loyalty. But by the Heian era, war evolved into philosophy. Mounted archery kyujutsu became the hallmark of the warrior, not just precision but presence. The yumi, a towering bow, demanded strength, grace, and spiritual focus. Later, it became Kyudoth, way of the bow, a meditative art as much as martial. Swordsmanship rose too. Kenjutsu was raw, direct, and deadly. These weren't cinematic duels, they were battlefield realities. Still, within the steel, a code emerged. Bushido, the way of the warrior. Honor, loyalty, clarity in the face of death. By the Kamakura period, martial training had become a moral journey. Every sword drawn, every arrow loosed, every throw in jujutsu was a step on a path to strength, yes, but also to stillness. In early Japan, to fight well was not enough. One had to die well too. Africa's martial legacy is too often ignored, yet it pulses through every beat of its history, bold, ceremonial, and profound. In West Africa, the Hausa people developed Dam, a combat sport born from warrior guilds and ritual duels. One hand, the spear, was wrapped tight for striking, the other open to defend. Fought during harvest festivals, Dambe wasn't a show. It was warrior training preserved through rhythm. In Senegal, Lam, wrestling, is national pride. It's not just a sport, it's a rite of passage. Wrestlers dance, chant, consult spiritual guides. They don't just fight, they embody ancestral energy. Zulu stick fighting was another test-off reflex, courage, and cunning. Practiced from youth, it wasn't just preparation for war, it was preparation for manhood. Even the legendary Shaka Zulu learned from it, transforming its core into military strategy that would redefine southern Africa. In Ethiopia, battle scenes etched in scripture and stone depict soldiers locked in synchronized formations, wielding short swords and shields. Wrestling blended into warcraft, building strength, stamina, and spirit. Across Africa, combat and culture were inseparable. Movement was memory, strike was song. The warrior was the keeper of rhythm and ritual. In the Americas, long before colonizers brought their steel, the land already pulsed with warriors. Among the Aztecs, martial culture was destiny. Boys trained in Telpocali, learning the art of the obsidian-edged Macuahuitla wooden blade that could shatter bone. War wasn't just conquest. It was cosmic duty. Capturing enemies for ritual sacrifice was considered divine work. Elite orders Eagle and Jaguar warriors were more than titles. They were transformations. Fighters became beasts in both body and soul. To the south, Incan soldiers trained for high-altitude warfare, mastering slings, spears, and boluses. Their battles weren't just territorial, they were spiritual. To fight was to balance the heavens. In North America, tribes like the Comanche, Apache, and Lakota developed advanced warrior systems based on stealth, horsemanship, and strategy. Hunting was training, dancing was readiness. Their war rituals weren't displays, they were sacred rites. To fight in these cultures was not just to protect, it was to honor everything: land, ancestors, and the eternal thread of balance. Across continents, across millennia, martial arts were born not in violence, but in vision. They evolved into more than survival techniques. They became stories told through movement, codes of honor inscribed in the body, rituals passed down in whispered forms, in footwork, in calluses. From Kalari Payatu to Shaolin Kung Fu, from Pankration to Dambe, from war dances to spear formations, every culture taught the same truth. The greatest enemy is within. Martial arts train the hands, but shape the heart. They weren't about domination, they were about discipline. Many of these systems were nearly lost band, buried, disguised, but they survived. In dance, in chant, in secret practice. And now they rise again in modern forms: karate, judo, capoeira, MMA, each a descendant of an ancient call to motion. Today, when a student bows before a master, when a fighter tightens their stance, they are stepping into a river of time. They are answering a call that echoes from temple stones, battlefield dust, and tribal drums. Because the core of every martial art is not to defeat others, but to master the self, to fight ego, to outlast fear. to wield spirit like a blade. That's the final lesson. That's the eternal form.